Hi everyone, my name is Nicola Wright. I'm Studio Voltaire's exhibition curator, and we're really excited to be hosting this talk in collaboration with the Architecture Foundation as part of the public programmes for our current exhibition with the artist William Scott. I'd like to start by thanking and introducing our speakers. So firstly, this conversation is being chaired by Nana Biamah-Ofosu. Nana is an architect and director of Studio Nyali, an architecture research and design practice based in London. She combines practice with teaching at the Architecture Association in London and Kingston School of Art, and has taught and lectured widely in the UK and abroad, including as a guest critic at Harvard Graduate School of Design. Nana was also part of the second cohort of New Architecture Writers and has since written articles for Architecture Today, The Architect's Journal, Frame Magazine, Icon, and Kinfolk, amongst others. We're joined by David Ogunmuyiwa, the founder of Architecture Doing Places, an architecture and urban design practice who aim to produce beautiful buildings and spatial interventions from an immersion in the arts and contemporary architecture. The practice specialises in the arts, housing and urban design, and were recently named an Architect's Journal AJ100 Disruptor Practice and included in New Architects 4, the Architecture Foundation's showcase of the best emerging practitioners operating in the UK. David has combined practice with teaching architecture to Masters of Architecture level at a number of universities. He mentors widely, including for the Royal College of Art Practice Mentors Programme, public practice, as well as students from the London School of Architecture. And David holds a number of advisory roles, including as a Mayor's Design Advocate for London and as a advisory board member of New Architecture Writers, supporting diverse new critics, writers and voices into architecture and design commentary. He's a board trustee of the Architecture Foundation and has been a curatorial board member for the London Festival of Architecture. He's practiced architecture in the UK and the Middle East and is a confirmed urbanist. Secondly, we're joined by Michael Maltzan. Michael founded Michael Maltzan Architecture in 1995. His projects cross a wide range of typologies, from cultural institutions to city infrastructures, and his notable projects include the Moody Centre for the Arts at Rice University, MoMA QNS, Star Apartments, the Pitman Dowell Residence, the new 6th Street Viaduct, MIT Vassar Street Residential Hall, and the Winnipeg Art Gallery Inuit Art Centre. Michael received his Masters of Architecture from the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University and his BFA and Bachelor of Architecture degrees from the Rhode Island School of Design. He's a fellow of the American Institute of Architects and received the 2016 AIA Los Angeles Gold Medal. He's a recipient of the American Academy of Arts and Letters Architecture Award and was elected to the National Academy of Design in 2020. He currently serves on the Dean's Leadership Council at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and the visiting committee to the GSD. Michael's work has gained international acclaim in innovation in both design and construction. The firm and its projects have been widely featured in national and international publications and have been exhibited in museums worldwide, including at the Museum of Contemporary Art Los Angeles, MoMA New York, the Heinz Architectural Center, the Canadian Center for Architecture, and the Carnegie Museum of Art. The firm's work has been selected for the 2006, 2018 and 2020 Venice Biennales. So some amazing people joining us this evening. So as I said, the discussion is part of the public programme for our exhibition with the artist William Scott. I'm describing William as an artist, but he often refers to himself as an architect or a scientist. And his work often concerns San Francisco and the neighbourhoods around Bayview, Hunters Point, where he grew up. And much of his practice centres on the idea that better lives can, in part, be achieved by reimagining the built environment. So here William's work is providing a starting point to discuss wider contexts in our speakers' own practices. So with that, I think I'll hand over to Nana. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you again, David and Michael, for agreeing to have this conversation with me this evening. I'm thrilled to be talking about William Scott's work and in the context of your own practices in Los Angeles and in London as well. And I guess I wanted to start the conversation tonight sort of talking about the biographical. And Scott's work references his own biography, examining his own personhood and as well as his built environment, especially places that he's familiar with, like Hunters Point and the wider Bay Area. I guess I'm interested in this element of one's own biography and the connections that we as architects make through our biographies to the city. And perhaps we can begin the conversation there. And perhaps with Michael, if you could talk a bit more about your own reading of Los Angeles as a practitioner embedded in the city and working, producing built projects within the city. And then I also want to pose the same question to you, David, about London.
First, thank you for inviting me, Nana, in Studio Voltaire to the discussion around William Scott's work. I practice from and live in Los Angeles. I'm not from here originally. I grew up primarily in the Northeast, in the U.S. and in a post-war suburb, Levittown, just outside of New York, which was really a planned idea, a planned community coming out of post-war social needs in the U.S. And after going to school, I had the opportunity to come to Los Angeles, to visit Los Angeles after undergraduate school. And I was completely taken by the city. In many ways, I thought it had a number of the characteristics of that suburb that I grew up in, which most people would think negatively of. People tend to speak about Levittown and those post-war suburbs in pejorative ways. But I, having grown up there, thought that there were incredible qualities to that. And it was very much a contemporary place. Los Angeles, for me, has been and continues to be an amazing laboratory of urbanism. It's a place that where experiment is very much possible, and is a kind of city that has a number of the challenges and problems that you see in other contemporary cities. So for me, the biggest part of Los Angeles is that while we focus on the specifics of the city, those lessons, those issues are really transferable to many contemporary cities.
Yeah. Did you want me to come in?
Yes, please. Thank you.
No, it's really kind of interesting listening to Michael, and particularly in the context of William Scott, because I think so in our practice we use this kind of it's almost like a mantra or a prayer or a kind of litany that we talk about, and we say kind of our shared built environment forms all of us inescapably. And in this way, it's a form of franchise, and we really believe that. And I think part of that is a kind of, personally, for my biography, so I've got a kind of, I was talking before we came on the call about a kind of peripatetic journey into practice in architecture. But it's also really interesting, the connection that has with kind of city and a city like London, in that the city forms us, but it also allows us to form ourselves. And there's this kind of reciprocal dynamic where we're able to kind of continually reinvent and kind of redefine ourselves. And what's kind of thrilling about the discipline of, I suppose, all creative disciplines, but art, architecture, the intersection between art and architecture, the way in which they influence each other, is this ability for us to kind of redefine ourselves and reconsider ourselves, and look at ourselves from different perspectives, and also kind of that has a spatial consequence for our environment. It has a kind of I suppose an approach to how we see space and how we see community and how we see identity, and I think that's something that's really important to us, that I've kind of come to kind of notice in William Scott's work since being kind of introduced to it in more than a kind of incidental way than I had been before.
Yeah, I think it's really, both of you kind of touch on this thing about kind of the definitions of the city in really interesting ways. And I like the fact that these definitions are kind of coming from a sort of personalized reading, perhaps for you, Michael, coming to a new city, and perhaps for you, David, a history that's much more embedded in a city, and those kinds of the ways that it shapes us. And I find also really interesting in the way that Scott calls himself an architect and practices as an architect, and thinks of his kind of paintings as manifestations of the built environment. And I guess my follow-up question to that is, how do you use these kind of biographies within your work, and how do they kind of manifest, or if they do, in the built artifacts you produce?
I think that's that in itself is a really fascinating question, because it gets at the most complex part in many ways of thinking about urbanism. Mm-hmm. It's one of the things that struck me about William Scott's work, that the individual narrative, the individual life is so present in that work, maybe even more so in a more poignant way than the architecture itself that he portrays, which is an image of architecture, but more general, more at a planning level, more at a level of abstraction. So I'm really interested in that idea of how you portray, not only how you portray somebody's individual life, but how you make space that supports that life. Housing is certainly one of the places where that can take place, and that's something we're always trying to imagine in how we design work, but also how we represent the work, and to try to represent those lives, make them more present in the things that we make. Just as a small aside, when we showed Star Apartments in the Biennale, previous Biennale, 2018, we made models of all of the apartments, small scale models of all of the apartments. And we went in and documented each of the apartments in incredible detail, and then recreated those apartments, with the goal being that you could image the changes, the differences in people's individual lives.
Mm. That's really fascinating. I really like this idea of the kind of merging of an abstracted background that architecture provides for as a kind of almost, I always think of it as a kind of infrastructure for daily life. It should be the thing that it provides space rather than curates the way that one lives. And I guess I want to also put that question to you, David, and perhaps the context of kind of working in contemporary housing practice in London, and kind of over the last few years, I think our discipline has moved, well, certainly towards larger urban regeneration projects, sort of more towards a co-design model, and how we work with the inhabitants of the places we're designing and the city itself. And perhaps also, yeah, if we could talk a bit about this thing of the kind of biographical and the city, and how that might be defined in the co-design process.
Yeah, I think kind of Michael touched on it earlier on when he was kind of describing the kind of, I suppose, the context in which he'd grown up. And I think it is really interesting. So the ironic thing about London is that whilst kind of I'm very situated in London, I've lived and worked on 3 continents. So I've kind of, and it's a very interconnected world. It's a very globalized world. There's a kind of diaspora for kind of culturally, but also architecturally, that extends to every corner of the globe, including yourself in terms of kind of working, teaching in Harvard and here, and both of you. So I suppose on one level, there is a kind of openness that is kind of inherent in that kind of, or implied in that kind of dynamic, in that it's to allow a kind of voice. It's about authorship and kind of what is the kind of Elsie Owusu, who you will know is a kind of very prominent British Ghanaian architect, spoke about kind of, I was listening to her last week and she was talking about kind of, you know, what is authorship and how do we define it, and you know, how narrowly or how do we widely do we define it? What is a kind of genius model of authorship where there's a kind of the fountainhead character and, you know, everybody else is kind of spinning around them, which is actually really kind of seductive to architects. I mean, I remember watching the fountainhead as a young person and being kind of, you know, kind of finding it as a kind of thrilling kind of idea of you know, really kind of powerful, thrilling idea. But at the same time, it's a really kind of singular and narrow idea from a kind of space. So even though all of our kind of, as you said, all of our kind of output creates environments, creates spaces, they're also contingent on other spaces that are used by other people. They're transformed by other people. They're customized by other people, whether we like it or not. So we kind of have to accommodate that in some way. And it seems to me as a kind of interesting creatively to see where the line is between kind of accepting that influence and resisting it, but resisting it in a kind of creative and personalized way, and, you know, expressing our own kind of, I suppose, egotistical kind of, you know, impression on the world. I hope this isn't just rambling, it's making some sort of sense. No. But there is a kind of there's a pleasure in that, and there's reciprocity, but there's also an opportunity in kind of seeing things. And one of the things we often, again, in our practice try and do is, I think you've asked me this question before in another space, and I've answered like that. We like it if the answer at the end, if the outcome at the end is a surprise. If we could have anticipated it at the beginning, we almost feel like we failed in some way.
Yeah.
We have a kind of sense, but if you can anticipate it in that much detail, where was the creative process, where was the creative journey? So in order to do that, you have to kind of feed it with catalyst, you have to feed it with fuel, you have to kind of challenge it and rub up against something and kind of, you know, put some grit in the oyster to come up with a pearl. And I think that openness is in some ways, I suppose I'm saying that kind of openness to co-design is a purely selfish impulse in some ways, because it's really kind of, it's a gift to the designer in many ways.
Yeah,
it's interesting that it's one of the places that I think architecture and urbanism, which are often seen as two different practices, where they have the ability to actually come together. Architecture often is a practice where when you are done, often the building is done. It's meant to live in many ways, classically, as a complete sculptural form and space, and to be you can evaluate it on its own terms. But urbanism is always more contingent. It's always more of an armature for those kind of overlays of activity, life, and those multiple narratives. And I actually think that is one of the places where Scott's work does touch on that in between. I would say he calls himself, I believe, an architect, but I think he really has a foot in each of those worlds, the urban world, the urbanist world, and the architectural world. And much of it comes back again to this idea of the surprise, David, is talking about, the result that you're not able to completely anticipate. You can set in motion, you can try to create a catalytic foundation for that to occur, but you don't necessarily know, nor can you control the ultimate result.
That's really really striking, and also leads in really nicely to my next question, because it picks up on both things that you both just touched on. Michael, with this analysis of Scott's work, is also touching on urbanism and the kind of definition of a more contingent practice, perhaps in relation to architecture. And David, I found the way that you talked about the design process and the kind of the end being a surprise, a question really about something really about the generosity of the process. And I think that's something that I found really interesting in looking at Scott's work and thinking about this evening's discussion, and it's why the talk is called the Wildman City. And I just wanted to perhaps draw a bit more on that in the kind of ways that Scott uses his practice to draw his city, to reimagine new ways for his city. And they cover a range of scales, as I think we've just noted here, that it talks about housing, public space, but also the city, and also largely actually the world. And he's kind of redefining and shaping that. And I'm interested in how these three scales are intertwined. And I think in both your practices, that's true for both of them, the ways that you work across these scales. And I wondered if we could talk a bit more about these three elements, housing, public space, and the city, and how they become intertwined and sort of share things, but also influence one another.
I was waiting for Michael to.
I'm going to let you go first, David.
I think so. It's really interesting. Maybe I'll start with the smallest of those, because I might question those scales as the only scales. Mm-hmm. I might go from in a typically kind of I suppose a designery way, start at the scale of the kind of the body and the hand as one scale, and then maybe some furniture as another scale, and then the house. Yeah. But each of these, I imagine in a kind of city with so much multiplicity, in all cities with multiplicity of kind of life and interest and concerns and priorities, that there will always be a kind of, I suppose, cross-contamination of all of those scales at once. There'll be kind of smear across, time and space, and where you can't really distinguish between one and another. It's almost like a kind of Doppler shift of, a trail of that, but there is this kind of sense of a kind of, I suppose, an origin, and I suppose in that I'm thinking of the kind of the home and domicile as this kind of shelter, this kind of apocryphal place where you start. And there is a way in a city, particularly like London, in a Western liberal society that's got a certain level of kind of social provision for people who have the least. There is a way that there is a kind of cultural approach to providing at least that to a specific standard. There's been kind of various kind of technical and typological innovations of that over the past 100 and 150 years, from garden cities to homes for heroes after the First World War, to kind of the Beveridge settlement after the Second World War in the UK, to a kind of new understanding of what homes are going to be like now and in the future. We're going to be spending more time, before the pandemic, we were talking about, are we going to be spending more time in homes because of, automation and universal basic income? And before you know it, you turn around and there's a once in a generation pandemic, and that's a kind of, or once in several generation kind of pandemic, which kind of redefines our relationship with our internal spaces and the places where we call home. So I think that's a kind of, I might slice that in a different way, and I might start to talk about the kind of the personal, which then I suppose kind of connects back to William Scott, because that space, you could talk about it as a kind of the home, but it's also the personal. It's a place where you feel the most safe. It's a place where you feel the most kind of, it's your refuge. And in that space, you're able to kind of consider your connections and reflect with your connections and other people. I love the word Michael used earlier on about the kind of poignancy of William Scott's connections with, for instance, his mother in his paintings and his sister in his paintings, but also a kind of broader community. So he's almost kind of expanding that scale within his own work, within what appears to be these kind of very consistent kind of panels of portraiture, but actually they're all defining or describing, ever increasing kind of communities of interest and communities of people, I suppose.
This whole question of scale, I think, is one of the most interesting ideas to grapple with when it comes to talking about things like urbanism and architecture in the city. And scale is, as we know, is often thought of as a formal device for architects and urbanists. We learn how to make distinctions of scale and try to provide a range of scale in the things that we make. It's similar to, in a very abstract way, formal abstract way, to an idea about texture or color or any of the other tools that we have. But it goes so much deeper when you're actually talking about questions of the city. And David was mentioning the idea of the individual and the individual scale, which I think is very important. I was thinking as David was talking a little bit about film and how often film is able to describe the different scales, for instance, of a person's activity across the day by zooming into certain details of their life, and then describing transitional moments when they move from inside to outside and the scale difference in that, and then maybe zooming back in really a view of the entire city that individual is in. And to a certain extent, I think Scott's work has some of that quality, that constant zooming in and out of the relationship of the individual and the collective. And I'd say, potentially scale is also, in these ideas about architecture and urbanism, one of identity, and how the scale of the individual works and how the scale of the collective works, and what's the relationship between the two of them. I was struck by a number of his paintings where they're the buildings in the background, and you see all of the buildings and all of them have their lights on at the same time. Everybody's home, which is kind of a profound idea. And then he goes on to talk about things like the balcony as being a very specific part of somebody's identity who lives in that apartment, but also a very generous idea for how that person's life can be ennobled. If you have a balcony, you have access to outdoor space. And then it really starts to become the scale, as we talked about in the portraiture of the individual. And that range is something probably, to more than anything, the lesson to be taken is to be mindful of that it really is the full range that you're grappling with when you're making buildings, making cities, and everything in between.
Yeah, I also really enjoyed reading his what he says about his paintings and how he talks about the balconies. And he says, they're to make people better and to make people feel better. And I thought that was really interesting, this kind of the personal, and actually that realizing that architecture goes beyond the kind of formal questions and into how we engage with it as people on a kind of everyday basis. And I really enjoyed also the language he uses in describing his work. I thought was a very powerful reflection on it. I guess both of you have touched on something that I find really interesting about this, and it comes back to a question on maybe on type, and something about the way that a type sort of accrues and becomes a multiple and generates another scale. And I thought that was really interesting to reflect on, given kind of both your practices in cities and these questions about density, which I think are also related to type and typology, and really kind of questioning the image of the single family house within the city. And I know that, Michael, your work directly engages with that, especially in the kind of sort of questions about LA as a kind of sprawl and the kind of edges and kind of limits of the city, And then I think in kind of your practice situated in London, I think these are very contemporary questions about how we make how we make housing or house or kind of the urban block, and all these different words and meanings that come with this. And I wanted to have a bit of a conversation around type, because I think that Scott's work does this really well in that he forces this kind of collective vision of the city that is perhaps very different to perhaps the architecture of a single family home.
In Los Angeles, it's probably density. The city is facing coming out of COVID, an even greater series of challenges. But for a number of years, one of the realities that's been driving so much of the pressure on the city is this issue of density, and the change from a single family house sprawl city, a post-war carpet model of individual home ownership, to the realities that that's reached its conceptual and also physical boundaries in many ways here. It's meaning that density is something that we're grappling with, and because we don't have necessarily a long history of traditional models to depend on to develop that density, the real potential here is to invent typologies to go forward with. It allows you to, at least I believe, it allows you to step back and think about what a type, a repeatable type, means to a culture like this, a contemporary culture like this in the 2020s. And how does that navigate between a lot of the expectations that still we have here culturally around the single family house? You have privacy, you have a small garden, even if it's a tiny setback from the property line, that helps you to make your life better, in William Scott's words. And how that transitions to something where genuine density it relates to that history of the way that we've lived here, but brings something new, brings a greater ability to develop sustainability and community and connection in a city like Los Angeles. In that sense, in a place like LA, and I think in many contemporary cities, there isn't necessarily a clear typology that's winning out. There isn't a clear direction that's winning out. We're really in the phase of great potential experimentation.
No, I do love that idea of the density, and I think one of the things that William Scott's work implies to me is a kind of expectation of density, not necessarily in built form, although that's kind of very clearly laid out even on architectural paper with the title block, really kind of like really interestingly kind of emphasized. It really kind of emphatically emphasizes a kind of claiming an architectural authorship, but also in terms of kind of community and people. And I think more and more, and this is often really intuitive, I'm sure Michael and yourself, Nana, find this as well. In practice, there are a lot of these things that we kind of have the space to reflect on and articulate now, but do we actually respond to quite intuitively? And only kind of, I often find myself post-rationalizing a lot of these kind of decisions. But I like the idea of a kind of neighborhood. So I might talk about the kind of density as a kind of neighborhood and the opportunity for a neighborhood. And just listening to Michael there, I think there's a kind of heroic pursuit, and I do see it as a kind of heroic pursuit. And how do we create these kind of homes and units of homes that fit for kind of people that want to inhabit them, that are kind of spaces that people can thrive and grow and kind of express themselves to their full potential, which also kind of brings me back to another point that Michael made on the kind of previous point, which is about kind of scale and identity. I really love that idea, Michael, the idea that kind of at a smaller scale, that is a way of kind of also forming your identity, because there's this link that is kind of always at the edge of consciousness, of my consciousness, which is something about kind of these private spaces where you get to think, and that kind of the connection between kind of private space and the higher purpose is actually a lot closer than you think. It's, your shower is your kind of refuge where you can think great thoughts, or even your toilet, part of it being crude, but these are places where you kind of have these kind of higher purposes, and kind of being able to create enough of these places where people can live together and be communal, but also electively kind of separate themselves when they need to, but joining in with other people when they need to, is probably more productive. It's certainly better for the environment in many ways. Yeah. But it's also kind of better for well-being. Before there was in the UK, before there was this pandemic, there was a pandemic of loneliness that's been kind of documented. But it's a double-edged sword. So the kind of density is a kind of problem, but it's also an answer simultaneously. And we're always in that kind of zone that artists work in, that is a kind of liminal space that people don't necessarily have to define very clearly, but just suggest.
I find that really interesting, the kind of question about what you just said about density is can be part of the solution, but it's also sometimes part of the problem. I just paraphrase that badly, but the idea is still there. And I think it comes to a question of sustainability, and a question about what is kind of sustainable growth, and a question of a sustainable city. And I think both your practices directly engaging with these questions. And what I really enjoy about both the ways that your offices work is that this question is not an additional thing. It's very much at the root of what you're doing. So it's in the root of how you sort of come up with the kind of beginnings of a project. At least that's what I sort of read in the work, that it's a kind of foundational question. So it's a question about the urban block. It's a question about what parts of the building you might reuse or might add to, or a question about the kind of longevity of a scale of the city. So not only responding to the contemporary situation, but responding towards a future situation, meaning that a building can be truly sustainable in that it's reaching beyond what we currently have. And I guess I just wanted to talk a bit more about the question of kind of about sustainability in your work, and also in relation to Scott's work, because I think Scott's work also tackles some of these questions through the ways that sometimes paintings are made from new buildings, and you can see bits of existing buildings like community centres. This also draws a question to this idea of, in the physical sense, what we keep and what we add, but also a kind of social sustainability, and a question about sustainability in the broader sense of it, whether it be the physical, social, economic, or cultural as well. So
I think that is a really interesting question to grapple with, because sustainability is thought of course, in so many different ways, and often it's thought of in more technical and performative ways. How does a building perform? How do you work with alternative energies and make the buildings more carbon neutral in its construction technique and its use afterwards? All of those things are extremely important, really hugely important. But there is this question around the bigger issues of how you make the city sustainable. And the moment you, I think, ask that question, it broadens the conversation to issues around real social concerns, political concerns, community concerns. One of those is, how do you keep things in place? How do you preserve things? And by things, I mean both physical buildings and also physical communities while you add to and overwrite and palimpsest new density on top of, in, and around that. We have, like many cities, a real challenge around gentrification in Los Angeles, which is the displacement of communities for new communities being built there. And I think there's genuinely one of the issues is, do you need to push one community out to try to provide that other type of higher level of density? Do you need to clear the land, in a sense, to deal with this challenge of density? I don't think you do, but it means a much more complicated, much more complex, much more nuanced approach to building in the city. And it often generally means new ways of thinking about working with existing buildings. We did a project a number of years ago, Star Apartments, I think I referred to before, where we kept a one-story building and built on top of that. It was an unusual thing to do in a city like LA, where normally you come in and just clear the site, especially for a one-story building. But a part of the goal was to challenge whether you could preserve existing fabric, low-scale existing 1-2-story fabric, and create a new type of density by adding to that and partnering the new buildings with the older buildings. I don't know that that's necessarily I don't believe it is the typology, as you were referring to typologies before, but it is a way of approaching this challenge of holding on to and allowing what exists in the city to continue to thrive, and being inventive with how you add to that. But much of that is also outside of just the hands of the architect or the planner. It requires the community to be involved. It absolutely requires the politicians to be involved. It absolutely requires the building officials to be involved. So it's a different level of conversation that has to take place before even, I think, the architectural ideas, the design ideas can begin.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I found probably most instructive and educational about William Scott's work, and I think one of the things I've taken away from it is just how po-faced we can be as architects, because we're in a very serious profession in many ways, as Michael's saying. We have to be, buildings need to perform to particular standards. They need to meet various codes. They need to kind of meet various statutory requirements, and that's obviously important because they need to be safe places. But one of the things that the kind of Afrofuturism and the kind of the spaceships and the technology, but also the kind of persistent smiles in every single thing, and I mean that in a kind of, like literally, there aren't anybody in any of the images that I've been able to see that is frowning or sad. Everybody is smiling, and there is this. What I mean by that is there is this kind of intuitive optimism that is fundamental to sustainability. There's a reason for the sustainability. It's not we preserve things so we can all be miserable. There's a kind of purpose to it. There's a kind of positive case for it. It's almost like a kind of positive business case for why we should be sustainable, that it's a joyous thing, it's a celebratory thing. And in Praise Frisco as well, just the kind of celebratory positivity there is a really kind of important tool, I think, as kind of, every architect has ever had to present to a group of people their work has to be optimistic and upbeat about it, and has to kind of demonstrate its virtues and demonstrate what it provides and what it kind of how it adds to the world and not doesn't take away from it. And that kind of enthusiasm is something that I think is really kind of effortless, but also persistent in the work, and is kind of carried through these various kind of disparate kind of motifs, like the kind of the spaceships and the smiles, and the kind of the sheen and the brightness and the kind of the glow of everything, which is really quite impressive. Because I find myself, I don't know about anyone else, but I find myself more and more in conversations that are very, very serious about these issues, because it is a serious subject. But one of the other conversations some of the conversations we have when we're talking to, say, residents on projects that we're doing where we're building next door to them, is to try and engage them in what sustainability means and why it's a good thing, and why it's a positive thing, why it's not a chore. And that's a really difficult thing to do without a kind of sense of optimism about what sustainability can do for you, or the benefit of it is.
It's such an interesting idea that, to think of him as a utopianist, and I mean that in a very profound way, not somebody who's thinking about things that are impossible, but to imagine the very best outcome if you were to approach these challenges in, as he said, an optimistic way. So much of the conversation around cities, and certainly in the last 2 years, have been around the impossibility and negative aspects of cities. And coming out of the pandemic, I've been fearful that many of the gains that have been made in developing approaches to things like density could be lost, because there are many people who don't want that. They think the single family residential model is by far the better model, and that density brings urban problems and challenges, and makes a city less livable. But that idea of creating a model and an image of the very best result, it's actually quite radical. It's like a I don't know how to describe it, but like a radical utopianism that is it is infectious. It's very difficult to look at that and think a dense city would be a less good city.
It's got a kind of can-do heroic. I mean, that's how for me it connects back to the Fountainhead, because it's got this kind of heroic single-mindedness that you know, or kind of particularity that you have to bring to that project if you're going to transform things, and kind of, you know, it's same, you know, model cities 200 years ago were about people who had a singular vision that they wanted, you know, singular utopian vision that they wanted to kind of demonstrate and projected one. They had to convince people that these things were going to happen and they were real, and you know, proof of concept sort of thing. And I really kind of keep going back to praise Frisco in that context. It's just this kind of joyous outcome, this kind of, you know, this vision piece of the future that's kind of you know, shining on the hill. It's kind of a really important component.
Yeah, I'm really enjoying this part of this discussion, especially about the kind of I love the phrase that you use, David, about intuitive optimism, and I think that so much of Scott's work definitely has that quality to it. It's really speculative. It's kind of a man reimagining and dreaming what his city could be, but also with a kind of seriousness that's kind of, for me, makes it almost a bit like a manifesto or a kind of vision for the city, and really kind of taking it beyond just a kind of painting and into the realms of imaginations towards a future architecture. And I like the fact that he also describes his work as himself as an architect, because I think that really captures that sense of it. And I guess I want to talk a bit about your own kind of manifestos for the city, and thinking about the places that you work and what kind of future visions for the city that you think need to be manifested. And also thinking about choosing to kind of talk about manifestos as kind of this vision into the future, which I think that Scott does well to address in his project, in his paintings. But also there's a kind of reflection on the past and what could have been that really comes across in his work. So there's lots of reference to 1975 and 1976, and the paintings of those are very much a kind of reimagination of what could have been. And I think that there's something about that, what could have been and the future, that combines very nicely into kind of setting a kind of manifesto for the city. So I wondered if we could expand a bit more on that.
Well, in terms of an approach, I don't know if it's a manifesto about the city exactly, but an approach to the city that increasingly I'm focused on is around the ways in which architecture, urbanism, and approach to the city can work to produce an urbanism of connections, as opposed to an urbanism of separations. Los Angeles, for much of its life, prided itself on being thought of as a multicultural city. After the Rodney King uprisings in the early 1990s, it became clear that the city was not really a multicultural city. It was a city of many cultures, but those different cultures were largely siloized and separated and disconnected in the city. And if you're going to talk about a better, more optimistic future for a city in general, but a city like Los Angeles, you have to find ways to create spaces, forms, structures that enable connections across those different lines, across those different between those silos. One of those ways is by rethinking the idea of infrastructure as a public form, and the way infrastructure can work in cities. Los Angeles is known also as an infrastructural city because it has lots of highways. The terrible irony of those highways is that when they were invented, they were thought of as something that would increase mobility and connection, but they've come to become physical boundaries and walls between neighborhoods. Rethinking the role of infrastructure so that it becomes more a connective tissue in the city, I think is quite important. And David, you mentioned the term liminal space or an idea of the liminal, and I think that's an interesting question for urbanism. Cities will always be made up of fabric and monuments, individual spaces, but can you actually produce a city where your focus is on those liminal spaces, those in-between spaces, the spaces that are in a sense shared by and colored by and activated by a wide range of communities, and that I think is that's a really fascinating thing to try to imagine. The one part of just in Scott's work, Studio Voltaire looks like, and one of the things I saw, they had there's a public realm works part of the project, which are these large billboards of individuals, and I found those some of the most striking because it was where the individual and the city as background were absolutely, they were collaged into this single plane, and I thought that was almost the most exciting part to me, because I thought that actually that's the city that he's imagining right there, and also a prompt. to say that's the image of the city that we're trying to actually produce.
Yeah, I mean, I really, I mean, that I was also struck by that image or kind of triptych, I suppose, the way it's been, presented and hung, I suppose, in a kind of urban, in an urban way, because I suppose it relates back to your point earlier, Nana, about the various different scales of the kind of, the personal, the biographical, the kind of neighborhood in one of them, and then I love the kind of the En Vogue with all their names, because this is a kind of international group that would be familiar to people on all continents. So there's this kind of, and then there's a kind of the sports kind of start at the top, that which is about his own kind of personal reflections on his, on time and kind of his alternative reality. But I think one of the things that I've found strongest in the work is this idea of kind of this implication about authorship. So each image is often crying out to me, particularly the architecture, specifically architecture and urban ones, about the kind of idea of authorship. And this brings me back to his kind of insistence on the title of architect, because in the UK we have the protection of title of architect. So it's a kind of, not anyone can theoretically call them, well, anyone can theoretically call themselves an architect, but not anyone can legally call themselves officially an architect. And that idea of who gets to be the author, and in kind of paintings like Frisco, it's about a kind of, give me the opportunity to do this. If you gave me the opportunity to do this, I could really make this work, and I would bring all these people, and I would kind of galvanize all these people, and we would make it better. People would get better lives, as a kind of insistent refrain that's been going. And I think the interesting thing about that is that there is a kind of resistance, I suppose, from the profession to be as open in that, and maybe that's also with other practitioners. So it's really interesting, Michael, talking about kind of a practice of urbanism, a kind of, but that isn't as narrow to kind of town planning or urban design, for instance, but all the sorts of things that kind of activate public space in those kind of spaces that Michael was talking about. And where do we kind of find the practitioners who ensure that these little kind of fabrics of public life, where people can kind of meet and exchange, where people can kind of, share with others, see each other, even if it's just incidentally just parade, the kind of, who's making sure that these spaces exist in a kind of holistic way. Often local governments are doing it, but not always. And sometimes that is a kind of, particularly in cities like, for instance, in New York, with the kind of recent Heatherwick projects, which are very beautiful to look at. I mean, you see them coming from a distance, coming down an avenue in New York, and they're kind of, gleaming, literally gleaming in the light. But they're privatized space, and there is a kind of issue about who owns what, who's allowed to kind of contribute to those processes. And can it only ever be, can William Scott only ever be an architect in this kind of very speculative way, rather than a really kind of practical way, with practical outcomes that are architectural and architectonic?
Yeah.
You wonder if, well, I was just going to say, when you were talking, David, it made me think of, in a way, creation, and not creation exactly versus action, but creative and action. And more and more, I think there is space for architects to move beyond the disciplinarily specific brackets and parentheses of what we normally do, and to think of architecture and the architect as a choreographer. And it seems to me that that I would absolutely vote for William Scott to be able to take that on even more, because there's an even deeper need to bring that wide range of individuals who are interested, who are motivated, who have different types of expertise, to take on an increasingly more complex challenge of working in the city.
And
so
interestingly, yeah, sorry to interrupt, Michael, but interestingly, artists don't feel those constraints. So that, you know, they're quite happy to be those kind of protagonists in those, you know, in kind of choreographing what's going on around them, and have for literally decades. It's not a kind of new or strange thing to them. They don't really see those boundaries which we seem to find.
I guess this brings me. I've got so many questions, but I'll pick my final two as well. I just wanted to touch a bit on that kind of the way that Scott is working as an artist who thinks of himself also as an architect, and reversing that. I think two practitioners who whose work is infused by a kind of art practice. And Michael, with knowing a bit about your history and your kind of education, and then beginning to do your practice, and David, through other conversations with you about kind of the use of an art practice and color in your work, and how some of these, I really enjoyed just the discussion there about the kind of the ways that these two things, which can be read as silos, actually cross-pollinate each other. And I wondered if you could both talk a bit about how you kind of approach your work through with a relationship to a kind of art practice.
Well, over the years, our practice in particular has worked with a number of artists and art organizations building spaces for the arts. And that continues to be a very important part of our practice. But it really grows out of my personal background, coming from art school, as a way, which was the way that I came to architecture at the Rhode Island School of Design. We were talking about this a little bit before the event started, that I learned to be an architect at an art school where in the very beginning, there aren't those distinctions between disciplines, whether you're a painter or a sculptor, graphic designer, you're all thrown in together. And you approach work and you approach seeing things, making things from a broader, really a broader foundation of creative practice. I believe in that. And I've continued to try to make our office, our studio, very much a place that has those values central to how we approach projects. So we're constantly looking for ways of creating broader partnerships across the work, taking it out of the specific confines of the professional definition of architecture. And I think that has enormous importance when you're talking about urbanism, cities specifically.
Yeah, I think for us, it was almost the opposite from Michael. And it's really because, so I didn't go to art school. I would have loved to, but I wasn't as kind of, I think my kind of foundational kind of creative impulse was actually is more literary, and it's more kind of particularly short stories and kind of short form. And the reason I raise that is because it's about a kind of it's about the idea of being a stylist, and the idea of doing something extremely technical and extremely kind of particular in a technical way that's really important. That seemed to have a kind of read across. It's relatively actually a superficial read across. I wouldn't read too much into it, but there is a kind of attention to a kind of way of putting something together that's very particular that I find interesting. But our kind of expanding beyond that, the way that art practice influences us and has begun to influence us and kind of is always there in some form, is actually quite a self-conscious project from our point of view, because, and maybe in a way it kind of relates to William Scott, because we were always asking, what does it take? What does it mean to be an architect? What does that practice consist of? What are the components? And there is a bit of something kind of romantically, broadly creative, that's kind of unconstrained, but there's a bit of something technical, there's a bit of something stylized, there are these kind of conventions that are required to kind of observe, break, respond to. But it almost relates to the point that you raised earlier about kind of manifestos, and I think instinctively I'm suspicious of manifestos, because I think what we found quite quickly was that some of our other interests, which were about these kind of the end users and but we're kind of accidental activists in a way. We're not, we're trying to be designers, not necessarily trying to be activists. But where we find ourselves on that kind of process of trying to, that methodology of trying to generate a design and make a design, often kind of carries us through asking questions that are more about lived experience, or are kind of more experiential in a way that we can grasp, and that feel direct and straightforward and relevant to us, and not abstract and dry. But we enjoy those, but they do feel, quite often we're in this kind of world. It's that same thing I was saying about the kind of density. It's the same thing with the kind of the academic legacy of architecture. It's kind of thrilling and exciting and self-referential in a way, but also there's a kind of, it can be quite dry and abstract. And the further it gets away from that, I think the kind of less we enjoy it almost. So our antidote to that is almost to kind of look at how an artist might approach that same complex question in a really direct and simple, intuitive way that's kind of beneath language and beneath kind of academic text, and kind of subtextual and intertextual, and kind of it's there somewhere, and we kind of feel it, but we're trying to find it. And artists seem to just be able to cut through all of that in a really simple, straightforward and exciting way, I suppose.
I really enjoyed both your responses to that, and it sort of brings me to my concluding question, and it's the same one I asked in the last conversation, and it's centered around William Scott's letters to Gavin Newsom, which I found really interesting, thinking about, Michael, how what you were saying about the ways of kind of your induction into an architecture, into thinking as an architect wasn't to kind of by the title, but rather the act of kind of doing. And David talking about this thing about language, I found really interesting, and these two things for me are really interesting. We could talk more about it, but I found Scott's letters to Gavin Newsom really interesting, because there's a powerful sense of agency and advocacy in his work in this particular letter. He uses language in a very profound way, a very direct way as well, I found. And also the ways that he refuses to just be a kind of passive dreamer. And he's engaging with a politician in the way to galvanize these paintings towards action. And I wondered in conclusion, if we could, I feel like this is a nice way to summarize the kind of breadth of this conversation, is the ways that we've moved from kind of, from the beginning, a kind of biographical reading of the city, the scales of the city, towards a kind of more art-based, and that's the broader sense of the arts, language, visual, all of it, and towards a kind of all-encompassing framework for our cities, and where there's policy and engagement policy sit with between that for you both.
I suppose it kind of relates back absolutely to biography, but it also relates to the last answer, which is that kind of for us, and I'm not sure if this is always kind of really clear, but it's very clear in my mind for our practice. I mean, literally, the title of our practice is Architecture Doing Place. And those are very kind of specific words to put together in a strange kind of conjunction for a sentence. But the meaning of that is about, a kind of, we believe in kind of architecture as a kind of instrument. We believe in place as a kind of opportunity for kind of these neighborhoods, and we believe in doing, and there's action involved in that as a kind of, as we believe in being protagonists in that way. But our kind of project and our daily project in practice is both making architecture, but also making the architect. So ourselves, we're really consciously involved in trying to make an architecture practice and understand what that means, and make myself as an architect and other colleagues as architects, and what does that mean, and who gets to kind of be made an architect, who gets that conferred upon them in this kind of quite, you know, almost kind of mystical way. You know, so, and that's a kind of reciprocal process. So, you know, we make architecture that makes the architect, and then that architect makes architecture that makes, you know, a back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And it's a kind of, you know, this kind of overlapping kind of thing that just keeps perpetuating itself. And we're really kind of fascinated with that quite simple dynamic, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Over the years, we've been very fortunate as a practice to work on a wide range of projects, houses, housing, institutional projects. We're doing a very large bridge in Los Angeles right now, which is truly infrastructure. And I always felt that that was a quite natural range of things for an architect to be involved in. But I found over the years that I would get questions, I still get questions all the time about what kind of architect do you want to be? Because it seems like you're doing a little bit of all different things. And I've come to think of the practice as much as anything, the practice that's trying to prove the elasticity of architecture, and what architecture can do and what it can cover and what it can be involved in, as a positive agent for culture, for cities, for the discipline. It feels to me like that kind of breadth of the definition of the discipline or the profession is especially important now, because the effect that we need to have, or the things that we need to be involved in, go beyond a lot of those traditional capabilities of the professional. And those things are still important. They're still hugely significant, important. They're important things to learn. But those other parts, including writing letters to the governor, are just as important, because the way genuine change gets made sometimes is by making a form that's so compelling that it changes people's perception. And that is one of what is possible. And that is absolutely one of the tools of the architect. Mm-hmm. But just as often, I believe it's doing the less glamorous work of trying to move things forward by your advocacy, by having those ongoing conversations, to work on perceptions and preconceptions in that way. And I've come to believe that architecture really is this kind of pan-disciplinarily possible activity. Maybe one of the last great generalists professions that exist out there in a world that has become more and more interested in disciplinary specificity. And that idea of the generalist as being able to connect many different dots in the equation, but also one who can do things like bring optimism to the situation, I believe is more germane than anything right now.
Thank you both so much for your time this evening. I've really enjoyed the range of the conversation this evening, I think spanning a range of ideas and scales, but also diving into it through William Scott's work as a kind of sort of beginning, the site for this conversation to begin. And I really enjoyed our conversation. So thank you very much for your time, both of you.